straight into my slide. So,
oh, I'm in control.
Yeah. So, if you want to go 2 slides in, so I think just to like explain what I'm going to show today. Today it's just a bit of a. The main thing I'm going to show you is a project that I did as part of my master's thesis, and it was called Future Burglary, and it was looking at a community-led model of scaling up retrofit, and it was looking at the burglary area of Sheffield, which was one of the areas that Simon Ogden mentioned earlier in the book. So, and I'm going to bookend that with just a bit of an overview of my practice, and just because I think there's a lot of intersection between what we're talking about this weekend and that, and then I'll sort of follow that with just some projects that sort of came out of that project as well. So I studied architecture, and I graduated from my master's about almost 2 years ago now, and I sort of work across architecture, art. I've been a designer, producer, like social practice is kind of a big part of my work, and sometimes it's a bit of a research role. And these are some of the sort of thematic aspects of my practice. The next slide. So within my practice, I work with there's 2 organisations in particular I work with. So Studio Polpo, I've been involved with for a good number of years now, which are a social enterprise art, architecture and research practice based here in Sheffield, and also work with the Social Art Network, which is a community of artists which are committed to building agency fields of art and social practice, with somewhat the mutual aid sort of model of doing that. And I think there's some definite overlaps with EASA as well, which I might sort of mention. So next slide. So this is just a bit of an introduction to some of the projects I work on with Studio Polpo. So this is a mycelium pavilion that we're designing. It sort of came out of a sort of wider project looking at building a growing theatre, and this is a kind of mini project that kind of came out of that. So it will eventually serve as a kiosk, and it's just sort of looking at how the idea of how you might grow a building. So we're looking at using sort of green timber that we source from a local saw yard, sort of creating sort of panels made from mycelium, which is like the root structure of mushrooms. So we sort of grew them with school children from school sort of near the area. So an area called Healy in Sheffield, near an organisation called the Healy City Farm, which is really interesting. I don't know whether that's in your sort of plan at some point, but it's definitely one to check out. And so next slide. I'll skip through some of these a little bit, but this is a project with the archetype, looking at introducing the idea of using sustainable or reusing materials and sort of making things with them, or making the structure. So a lot of just sort of feeling, touching, playing with materials, and then sort of creating some kind of playful structure with that, and introducing the kind of principles behind that that are kind of that we use in our own practice as well. Next slide. And these are, I'll skim past this a little bit, but this is some of the other more conventional sort of architecture stuff we do. So doing a kind of retrofit and extension of a house in an area called neighbourhood here in Sheffield. And sort of during the pandemic, we were doing kind of looking at redesigning sort of spaces, which are generally more healthier, but kind of somewhat prompted by COVID pandemic. And this was for us local co-working, sort of social enterprise in the city. Next slide. So this was a project called DS2. So this was, it was both the design of a kit of parts that made a series of objects, and it was also part of a project looking at the idea of commoning, and looking at areas of common resource and sort of discussions around air quality. So we were sort of did a lot of workshops sort of playing with moss and collecting things, and we did this processional walk with the structure that kind of made it kind of turned into these caddies, and we went and we collected materials on the way, and yeah. And then I think this was just, so it's an ongoing project, and I think I just want to include this just to show that, you know, it kind of leads on to other things, and it kind of sits in the background and it comes back. And so those conversations with Louis around sort of using this with the National Food Service and sort of thinking like what, because it somewhat embodies similar principles, sort of how that might come about. And some conversations with Sally Laverne, who's an artist who we work with on this project, about creating like a hay oven, and how that could be used sort of across networks like the National Food Service. But that was just very much a like kind of very sort of initial like discussion the other day. The next slide. And then this is sort of continuing, sort of looking at sort of mycelium and network building, and sort of reflecting, using these ideas to kind of reflect on an organisation. So we were doing that with Food Hall, and it allowed us to have conversations about how sort of these mutual aid organisations sort of work together and how they operate, and pulling out sort of different ideas about how that translates and visualising that. And yeah, so next slide. So this is the social art network, which I've sort of become more and more involved with over the last few years. This is just to give a bit of a flavour of what we do. A lot of it hangs around meetups that we hold. So we're now sort of an organisation of different sort of independent hubs across the UK that just meet, share practice. And this is just a bit of a flavour of some of the meetups that we hold. And yeah, the next slide. And these are some of the ones that we've done here recently in Sheffield, or with the Sheffield group. So we did a project called Monuments and Memorial, where we were just sort of fielding different responses to that theme, and sort of we did that through sort of like this postcard, like people submitted like postcard submissions responding to the theme, and then we sort of ended that in having a conversation as a group around that. I had some really interesting artists like Yen Fondling. So we also sort of did an event with Coventry Biennial, where we had Hannah from Social Pickle, Food Hall talk, and Ruth Levine as well, talking about sort of sharing meals, harnessing cultures and grassroots systems at Coventry Biennial. And also we did this project sort of thinking about how we scale up like mutual aid networks. So we did this, we sort of connected with a group of artists in Leeds and sort of like worked quite closely with each other to see how we kind of support each other through a collective series of meetups to kind of create a new hub. And it works quite successfully. Well, yeah. Next slide. And then this is just sort of, alongside this, we're kind of doing a lot of thinking about how, as an organisation, we're at a point where it's got so large that we need to start like baking some of these ideas in somehow, or like organising becomes a real challenge. So how do we constitute an organisation and like articulate how we're organising? It's kind of, yeah. Next slide. I think I just sort of noticed it had a bit of a similarity to some of the stuff that Fran was saying about how the sample evolved and stuff. She's quite an interesting sort of diagram, sort of using those, how it changed, but that's quite. And then there's a number of projects. We've partnered quite a lot with an arts charity called Axis, which has been really good, because what it's meant is we've been able to grow as a network without actually having to constitute or like make some of these difficult. Yeah, so it's allowed us to sort of exist as this kind of quite loose collective in quite a slightly, so quite organically organised organisation for quite some time. So that's been really good. And we're collecting sort of an archive of social practice through this project. Next slide. And sort of experimenting with creating sort of new digital spaces that kind of sort of create sort of spaces which are kind of try somewhat to kind of not use sort of big data and create their own sort of digital spaces for artists. So this was an experiment sort of project we did called the social artists. Next slide. And then this is a project I've been working on recently called Climate Action Toolkit, which I was developing with Axis. And yeah, it's still got the watermark on it, so I literally just submitted that yesterday or a few days ago. So, but it's looking at this idea of how do you scale up climate action and sort of taking ideas from like the open source community and sort of create commons to kind of sort of build a kind of collectively built resource and have what I'm quite keen to sort of see what conversations like hang around that as well, not just what's literally included. So yeah, next slide. So now I'll just talk a little bit about future neighbourhoods. So want to go to the next slide. So next slide. Oh yeah, perfect. So Future Burngrave explores community-led retrofit by the activist community of Burngrave. So through common ownership of their homes, the project demonstrates neighbourhood-scale retrofit as an opportunity to add value to communities through social and technological infrastructure to live sustainably and affordably. Next slide. So Future Burngrave emerged from the spirit of our design studio, Studio Build Design, which was led by Lex Drake, who works with practical practice architecture, and it was kind of had a live focus, and it considered participation in building, placemaking, and how it might empower communities as well. Next slide. So this is this is quite a cool illustration that I think sort of just encapsulates a lot of these kind of like frustrating sort of moments trying to articulate like why we should do some of these things, and you know, yeah, I mean, so it was born out of the motivation to address the climate emergency, to consider decarbonising homes as an opportunity to address far more than just building performance, which is quite prevailing sort of narrative within sort of retrofitting and sustainable homes, and quite often the conversation comes back to sort of technology, when actually I think a lot of the issues aren't technological, or like the solutions aren't technological, they're sort of social and about how we, our perspective of the environment and our world and our relationship to it generally. Next slide. So it also builds on the practice, and sort of at the time I was sort of heavily involved with this group called Students for Climate Action, which we were sort of providing sort of like a critical perspective on the education we were receiving at the time, and sort of making demands of the university around that. Next slide. And I can't remember what to say about this, but oh yeah, here we go. So sort of alongside this, I was kind of thinking about this as a sort of broader sort of campaign or idea of future neighbourhoods, as a way of encapsulating some of the stuff in there, and sort of almost developing this kind of like messaging around it at the same time. Next slide. So UK homes are not good for the future. Next slide. So we're living in a climate emergency. Next slide. There's going to be a lot of these next slides. But no, sorry. That's a pre-warning. That's going to be next slide. Is like the new sort of full stop.
Okay, do you want to like do something like? I don't know, like a...
Yeah.
Click.
Yeah. The buildings that we have it and how we live in them is unsustainable, and this requires us to refresh our perspective. Oh, yeah, I'm not keeping up. I've got to click and swipe. So various reports conclude that the UK is home to not the future. 80% of the homes we'll be living in by 2050 haven't been built already. We will not meet the UK's targets for emission reductions without complete decarbonisation of the housing stock. Retrofit. Retrofit is the addition of new fabric, components and systems to improve performance and useful lifespan of buildings. The situation is significant in scale and urgency. We must retrofit 29 million homes. There are some scale retrofit projects in the UK, but unfortunately these are insignificant relative to the scale of the challenge. And sort of 2 years on now since actually doing this project, that's still kind of the case. But interestingly, Energy Strong on the left, they've done a kind of significant number more projects relative to where they were at the time. And most of these currently are social housing, where a critical number of existing homes are under social ownership. So, however, the majority of UK housing stock has fragmented ownership, with owner-occupiers accounting for 64% of homes in the UK. This is not the only crisis relating to our homes either. There's a housing crisis of accessibility and affordability, and the consequences of austerity as well. So the lack of local social infrastructure as well required for these communities. However, scale of retrofit can be an unprecedented opportunity for positive action as well. So this is future burn green, and this is realising some of these sort of propositions, or sort of through an architectural proposition itself. So the future burn green proposes an approach to respond to these issues, and I'll talk about this now through the idea of scale, social infrastructure, affordability and accessibility, and the response to the climate emergency. So first is scale. So how can we achieve this at scale? So individually this is limited, though collectively we can achieve far more. So this is somewhat illustrated by the sort of complete unaffordability of sort of retrofitting the home in the UK, and we haven't got anywhere. Next slide. So bit of an introduction to Burnbury. So it's a residential area to the north of Sheffield city centre, and it's one of the most socially economically deprived areas in the city, with an undervalued, diverse and vibrant community. It's close to the city centre, but physically cut off by the Wicker Viaduct and industrial areas to the east and west. It has a history of activism and squatting, and today there are several cooperatives and some community organisations which continue this legacy. Yeah, that's same notes. Next slide.
Sorry, next to this.
Yeah, sorry.
Arms, my bad.
That's me. My bad. So the project explores the neighbourhood block scale rather than sort of looking at retrofitting individual homes. So its scaling up is appropriate to the challenge it provides critical mass for new communities. Next slide. But small enough to maintain cohesive intentional community. So the neighbourhood block scale is at a scale comparative to other co-living communities, but be scaled further through more community organising at neighbourhood block scale. Next slide. So this is some of the nuts and bolts of this. So I think as maybe gathered at this point, it's sort of the language of this is like very much along the lines of a kind of super project. So we're now sort of delving into sort of a bit of a report sort of around the project. So and I think with this project in particular, this was sort of it sort of underpins a lot of the sort of architectural sort of propositions that were made. I think it has particular relevance to the kind of work we're doing as well. So I'll go into some of these extracts now. So next slide. So neighbourhood retrofit would be extremely difficult to deliver without legislation which encourages it. So this scenario suggests that we would need increased political will for green policy and funding. Community energy, housing and development cooperatives akin to carbon co-op would play a role in both building community support for such policies and serve as effective organisations for delivering these changes on the ground. This project speculates Community Retrofit Act 2021, we're now 2022, which provides a mechanism for communities to express consensus for neighbourhood retrofit and serve statutory orders necessary to establish community ownership of the collection of homes. So as part of this act, local councils would be required to commission sustainable street master plans, identifying committed changes to adopt highways in response to a shift away from car-orientated streets, small pedestrian focused streetscape with future sustainable transport infrastructure, sustainable drainage and greening streets. Next slide. So the community are represented by the Future Burnbury Development Cooperative, advised by the services of the Neighbourhood Retrofit Service, the project team appointed from the Neighbourhood Retrofit Services framework through consultants and contractors. That's right. The Neighbourhood Retrofit Service is effectively a one-stop shop for retrofit consultancy and project management services for homeowners and community-led organisations. It is incorporated as a community interest company and underwritten by the government. This service responds to the report People Powered Retrofit. The report identifies the relative complexity of retrofit projects and a lack of an effective service provision targeted at homeowners and communities as major obstacles to scale of retrofit. So it was also found from Carbon Co-op and Urbed's Green New Deals community project that retrofit agreements with multiple individual homes also introduce complex issues of project management. So simplifying this through households represented by the development cooperative and agreements between the co-op and the retrofit service suggests an alternative model which may be more appropriate for the scale of the model of retrofit. So the project, sorry, next slide. Oh, and I missed, that was meant to accompany what I'm saying. Might have made it slightly easier to understand. But I think just to sort of summarise this, I think it's just about simplifying the relationship so that it is easy to do, basically, to make it a bit more appropriate for homeowners, so you're not getting lost in this kind of this contractual mess, because not everyone should or is sort of interested in this or sort of have the kind of relevant sort of experience to kind of navigate this. So next slide. So the project programme suggests this project may be delivered by 2030. It's worth noting that this programme is ambitious and relies on significant support, so the project starting imminently. This demonstrates that scaled retrofit is unlikely to reach any significant level of carbon reductions by 2030. And adopting ways of supporting scaled retrofit is urgent. So, I mean, it's 2 years now since I did the project, and yeah, it's so far behind on this. And I think what was quite interesting about doing the project was through doing the proposition, it then allows to sort of reflect on the kind of how that overlays with the practicalities of delivering an architectural project through the existing systems that exist, and actually showing that business as usual does not achieve anything like what we set out, what we're setting out to do in the interest of kind of those. So next slide, please. So I'll skim over this a little bit, but in short, it's estimated that such a project would cost between sort of like 20 to 35 million scale that we're proposing. And just to give a bit of a comparison, so the last sort of big sort of chunk of funding supporting communities to sort of decarbonise sort of new Green Deal was only 20 million, and that was for a number of projects, not just a single project. So we're so behind on this area. Next slide. That's right, and the next one, sorry. So sort of coming back down to sort of the more architectural aspects of the proposal. So it responds to the common typologies and urban conditions, and allowing the approach to be relevant to neighbourhoods throughout the UK. So looking at how this as something that can be scalable. Next slide. So the site in Burnbury exhibits many of the characteristics. So it has old masonry homes, has car-orientated streets, a fragmented ownership of the space, and this is a very typical sort of northern urban sort of condition, really. So these typologies, sorry, next slide. So these typologies were studied in depth to inform the proposal. Through transitions from multiple private ownerships to a single mutual ownership by the cooperative of residents, works to the neighbourhood can be significant in scale, allowing for substantial reconfiguration of spaces, uses and boundaries. Next slide. Social. So the project proposes a co-housing model, which is an intentional community with a socially connected and supportive lifestyle. Next slide. So the community live in a balanced of common and private spaces, such as self-contained homes with shared living spaces, gardens and other amenities. Next slide. The new amenities are designed for the lifestyle future, such as transitioning to circular economy principles, workshops for making, repair and upcycling, shared stores for reduced individual ownership and consumption of tools and goods. Next slide. So this social and physical infrastructure provided locally allows for low impact living. Next slide. So different levels of co-living are also manifested in the house types. So these range from conventional 3-bed homes, next slide, to larger 6-bed homes for shared households or larger families. Next slide. To 8 to 12-bed cluster homes. So these provide compact living, cooking, eating spaces with semi-contained units of 1 to 2 bedrooms, with large shared kitchen living space for households. By accommodating compact kitchen and living spaces within private spaces, and allows for a cohesive social environment within larger households. So affordability and accessibility. Sorry, next slide. So mutual ownership. So mutual home ownership provides an effective model for affordable housing in perpetuity, and is more accessible to lower and secure income households. This model has been pioneered by Lilac. Next slide. So the project provides roughly 40% additional area of accommodation. This increases the number of homes and potential income for the co-op. The critical mass and it sort of provides, this kind of scale provides a critical mass for communities. The land value is less than proportion per square metre of floor space. But additionally, a densification of the existing urban sites preserve the environment and ecosystem elsewhere. So options, sorry,
options?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Sorry. So option spaces. So this is by densifying, it allows possibly to open up other spaces for new uses. So these are flexible spaces which could be sort of community or commercially used. So they could either be used to address the needs of the community of this development, of the wider community, or it could be used as a source of income. Next slide. So response to the planning emergency. So this will just sort of explain some of the sort of more architectural moves to that effect. So there's a value of the existing fabric and extending its useful lifespan. So external retrofitting will achieve the best performance upgrades in buildings envelopes, both sort of climate change mitigation and adaptation. So this makes significant changes to the external character of our neighbourhoods, though entirely appropriate in proportion to the scale of action necessary. So this also shows that these homes can still be beautiful as well. So while internal retrofit approaches can be considered, demonstrating that retrofit can be an opportunity to enhance neighbourhoods is key to making a strong case for scale of retrofit. Slide. So External retrofit takes the size and character of spaces internally, and we also get a glimpse of formerly external brickwork inside. It employs principles with the intent of going beyond net zero in the context of the net zero Britain scenario. So this is in reference to the Sensible Alternative Technology report, the same name. So it employs passive house principles to super insulated and airtight operational energy. It has on-site renewables by clean energy and supply resilience. Has technical space on site for on-site plant, allows for energy storage management systems not available or affordable for small developments, as well as a small electric car pool as well. So, low impact materials. So it also uses low impact materials, which favouring those that can suppress the carbon, reducing the upfront, and those that reduce the upfront impacts of building emissions. So key materials which we use in the project are wood fibre insulation products, laminated wood beams for any high performance structure as an alternative to steel, and recycled glass foam aggregate for structure below ground. So next slide strategy. Site strategy. So the project reinterprets the existing back-to-backs. Next slide. I think I might have to go back to clicking now. Densifying the rows allows for additional new programme. The south row consists of larger cluster homes with stacked duplexes with deck access to the north row. These enclosed and shared garden. These enclosed and shared garden, a place for relaxing, meeting, playing, and growing. The majority of homes are accessed off the street at ground floor, with the remainder from the deck. All ground floor homes have direct access onto the garden via patios. The blocks deviate at the ends with a yard and a covered space to the east and a technical space to the west. This shows this shows a through house, which is a break in the block for access to the garden, as well as refuse store, community rooms, and drain. Here, the covered yard to the east is shown. This acts as a flexible space for the community, which can serve either the workshop to the left of the view or the common house to the right of the view, as well as the garden and the yard adjacent. The technical space to the west houses plant energy storage alongside a large pipe store with lightweight polycarbonate pavilion above for use by the community. Building resolution. So this looks at planning of the actual houses themselves. So resolution for homes. Next slide, please. The existing homes built in units of 2 have been combined in order to add generous new spaces. Living spaces on the ground floor for access onto the street and garden, bedrooms onto the first floor. The new double height living space orientated to the south creates a feature of the existing formerly external wall, which acts as a thermal battery for the house. Next slide.
Sorry. Oh no. Sorry.
3-bed home above has bedrooms below and a living space above. To make use of the uninterrupted south-facing aspect. The home fabric components and systems designed to passive principles, which details further in the report. So this is a bit about structural strategy and how it realises. So the material of the existing is initially audited. The existing masonry is retained, however, the majority of the existing timber is removed. While this is not always necessary, additional structure demand of the new storage requires timber elements to form to a higher level than existing. These are removed and processed on site in the covered yard. Many of these materials can be used for landscape, plain bricks are used as paving surfaces, slates used as tiling, shown this is a bit of the material. Sorry, next slide. This shows a bit of the material palette, and if you go to the next slide as well, this in the kitchen and use stuff like roof slates and areas like that. I think also just to give a bit of context to this, I know it's slightly out of order, but I think in terms of what I'm showing, I'm sort of showing a kind of maybe more heavy-handed approach to retrofitting and taking maybe slightly more out, because on site it's kind of responding to some of the worst case scenarios, and also there's a lot of people say, well, why can't you do that? So I think it's just sort of shutting down some of those arguments of, well, you can do it, but typically you can do it without taking so much out. But actually, even if you do, and across a large number of buildings, still go take slightly more out and achieve it. Next slide. So new timber platform frame is added with LVL beams for lintels and longer spans. Allowance for additional structure is considered in design, subject to the condition of the original from the survey. Slide. So reinterpretation of bay windows is designed to improve the stability of the structure. The construction build-ups of the scheme have been studied in detail as well, designed to achieve a U value below 1.5, which achieve Pascal standards. Next slide. Just a bit of a light zoom in. Next slide. And then the south facing windows fitted with adjustable louvers to respond to climate change. So, as the climate changes, it's important we have measures that can sort of adjust to realities of climate change. Next slide. And like water retentions, retention features, most visibly the water retention pond in the shared garden, mitigate the effects of extreme weather events as well. Next slide. I think that's that for the project. And then I'll just sort of introduce a couple of things that come after this as well, which could relate. So what next? So slide. So I've been working with Christina Cerulli, who's one of my colleagues at Studio Polpo, sort of just continuing research around retrofit, but looking at the community-led and social implications of that, and sort of challenging a lot of that sort of technical focus narrative. Slide. So I'm also working with Studio Polpo in sort of bringing the Sheffield Community Land Trust back to life. So that's the project that's working on, and we're looking at how we apply future neighbourhood sort of approach to this. Next slide. And then this is just a little bit of a diagram. I pulled this up because there's a little bit of relevance of talking about commons, and a lot of our conversations have sort of been around whether something is technically a commons or not. We're kind of encountering conversations about talking about projects which embody principles of community land trust but aren't themselves community land trust, and how do we, if we get too caught up on defining that too tightly, we actually forget to sort of bring new things through. So it's kind of acknowledging that there's somewhat blurriness to that. Slide. And another thing I've been involved with recently is I got involved in a hackathon with Energiesprong, who are sort of, it's a Dutch model of retrofitting, which is somewhat explained here. So it's so it's an approach for zero carbon retrofit scale, and it's paid for by energy and maintenance savings, and it's delivered by, it says here, new high-tech British industry. So it's kind of off-site sort of battery-made components, and it results in guaranteed actual performance and comfort costs long term. So they somewhat guarantee that to the people they provide the housing for, in order to create warm, affordable, desirable homes in the future. So they're piling a lot of these with, in particular, like Nottingham City Council. So I was part of a hackathon, next slide, and I was in a group of people looking at how you sort of build the desirability of retrofit, and particularly looking at how do you give Supla, which is obviously one of the larger sort of platforms like this, the retrofit makeover. Next slide. So, I mean, I won't go into this in too much detail, but yeah, it's about making retrofit more appealing, getting trigger points such as like when people move homes and sort of connecting with other retrofitters and trying to sort of sneak in sort of, and it's very commercial sort of focused, but actually how do you change that to be sort of more appropriate for sort of more community, yeah, people that are more community focused and involved perception of what is a good location as well. So yeah, that's me done. So I suppose just any questions really.
Maybe a bit, I was wondering if recently it's been changed in the development plan to add another story to things storage from the web. Something like that, and I've seen like, you know, the idea to add another building on top of the existing one. It just kind of makes me think of that, and do you think, yeah, do you think that would be possible to this kind of allowances of permit development? I mean, that's permit development, like, do you think you could basically probably not be something that like there could be some kind of influence that eventually people
yeah, definitely. I mean, you just can't. I mean, we're really. I mean, I think the approach I took with the project was to kind of propose something that kind of isn't getting caught up on the planning implications, so that then I could reflect on how to try and deliver that in sort of current sort of system, and then sort of suggest how you need to bend it back to work. So yeah, I mean, I think spot on, that needs to happen to allow us to do that. I think there's a lot of changes. That's one of the number of changes I think it's happened. But yeah, planning is a tool for addressing this, and planning isn't appropriate. But, yeah.
I think you mentioned somewhere that like 60 or 40% of the properties people actually live for what they own.
Yeah.
Right. My impression is that why retrofit is not happening here is that the people who rent properties to other people don't have to pay bills. Correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah.
I'm renting an apartment which has a cracked glass in the window for the last half a year, and I cannot get my landlord to change it. You know, and like we spend winter on heating every day because it's impossible. It's like temperatures like here, you know, and it's like 1,700 rent. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking like all the retrofitting and all this kind of stuff is literally comes down to political decision of making people who own the properties to get their shit together and literally, because if they would be sharing this cost of this living and like sharing the impact of having shit houses and single glazed windows, you know, because again, like who has to pay for it? I think that's the biggest thing.
Yeah, definitely.
In retrofit, because it's not a rocket science, isn't it?
Yeah.
By itself, design wise, it's not a rocket science. It's just like who is going to pay for it?
Yeah. It's kind of framed as like a consumer, like it's framed to consumers about the fee by not doing it, but that's just not the case. It's just simply not affordable. Like, I mean, even if you make all the retrofit measures, you're not doing it. You don't get savings from that. It doesn't pay itself back. So even like the Energy Strong model, then it's still their model is to rely on government grants to scale up, and then through the kind of factory method building. As they scale up, they get efficiencies of scale, which then bring the cost of retrofit down. so to a point where it starts to like be in the middle, if that makes sense. I mean, that's just one way of doing it, but yeah, so even some of the more exemplary scale methods of doing it still heavily rely on grants.
Yeah, it's I thought it was a really like the presentation in terms of how it related to like the bureaucratic and reality of kind of engaging with retrofit. I think it was quite refreshing. It gives you like, yeah, it's like a realistic. What are we realistically going to do here? Are we actually going to do it in time? Like by 2050, we need to have every house in the UK retrofit. Otherwise, we're in a climate emergency, and in the world of retrofit, which will be the largest amount of labour. You know, that'll be individually. That would be like, you know, almost all of our lives just spent doing retrofit. Do you know, like, which would just be such a huge industry, like to retrofit all of the houses in the UK to stave off climate catastrophe. So it's like, and the fact that we don't have this, you know, I guess there's like the political incentives or political will to do it, but also the kind of like non-functional market that doesn't function to understand environmental benefit as in any way, shape or form relating to the formal economy that we have. Like, what you say is like, who's got the costs, and it's like on one hand it looks like it's the consumer who's got the cost, but the planet's the real one with the cost. You know what I mean? It's like, and the cost is like, you know, just kind of dump there, and like, you know, but yeah, it's really interesting. But I think that like the economy, I guess one thing that I think we spoke about before actually, that the problem with one of the problems is the speed at which you can, like how fast you can do it, because moving a kind of enormous amount of families, right, is like really, really hard to do. Like people don't want to, unless it's like done in a day or something, people don't want to engage in like something that will move them out of their house for like 3 months. So there's like a sociological element as well to like the whole retrofit. Yeah. But it was really robust and like kind of clear proposal.
I think on reflection, I think that proposition that I've made, I think is quite a disruptive. It is relatively disruptive because people do need to move around to actually allow that work to happen. But if you are just like, externally retrofitting an existing house, you know, you can do it with the resident living there without displacing them. So it doesn't rely on that. But I think what I was looking at is kind of, particularly in urban settings, how can you kind of achieve densification to preserve other spaces from being developed? How can you, in doing that, provide added value in doing that work, which is otherwise going to be very expensive and disruptive?
Yeah, some of your plans are really like interesting, how you connect with the houses and stuff like that.
Do you think that like the current rising fuel prices have some effect on how Sheffield will be localized? It seems like in Ireland, we're going to give sort of a subsidy to everyone at a certain amount of money because we had such a spike, but that doesn't seem like it's the smartest thing to do. It seems like if they have to do that every couple of months, it's going to be more expensive. Yeah, maybe it's best to invest in a good system to retrofit. And then I would just ask, because the people that I do know live in houses that are in pretty poor conditions and mainly renters, that if you own a house, you sort of have agency to renovate it as you please. Like, is it about also imposing legislation which landlords have to maintain their house to a certain standard so that they can sublet a home that is like less standard? That's sort of controlling the market as well.
Yeah. I think without being too sort of like downbeat about it.
Don't say it, man. Don't say it.
Well, it does intersect with like the wider sort of social and sort of, economic, like the kind of capital, like neoliberal kind of context we find around ourselves in, really. You know, like a lot of the issues are kind of broader and more systemic, just like retrofit, I think. You know, and you know, I think sort of architecture is a solution. Like looking at architectural solutions to that problem are important, but I think it's more about how I think most of the changes need to happen in other areas, and then us respond to how those architectures respond to the new conditions of that. If that makes sense. But I suppose certainly since doing projects, I've kind of increasingly been involved in stuff like this, which is not actually about designing architecture. It's kind of more about engaging with the conversation and messaging of it. Yeah.
I think the kind of future of kind of architects engaging with this is at first point like policy and kind of like, you know, frameworks and things like that and relation.
Yeah, I would say. I mean, yeah, I would say that. I mean, I would say there is a lot of, I do think we are pretty ill-equipped. Like, it's changing, but like the way we practice architecture is still sort of very business as usual. And there's not, I think there's been an awareness that, I think we've reached an awareness, but I don't think that's translated to how we actually practice. What was the question again? I lost.
Is it better for architects to engage in policy and systems around retrofit rather than retrofit,
Yeah.
per se?
Yeah, so I think one example, one very simple example of that is I illustrated through this kind of extension of retrofit at the moment is you have to pay VAT on retrofitting a house, whereas you don't have to pay VAT on building a new house. So it's directly incentivized to build new. Right?
That's so wrong.
I know. So you know, it's just, you know, and you know, so take for example this client for the house, like it makes such a massive difference to what they can actually do. You know, because you're just knocking 20% off their available sort of funds to fund the project. And it's just insane. It's nonsensical.
It makes sense like the renting class.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's just another like example of how it's weighted.
Yeah.
So, like against the proletariat.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's like one of those things. It's like you say, like you kind of get frustrated with the bureaucratic systems and stuff like, you know, like the welfare state. It's like, oh, it's so badly designed. It's like, well, no, it's not. It's like really well designed for. But it's just not designed around our principles or like what we need from that system. So yeah.
Just one thing for me as well is like how you advocate for the architect's role in this process, because it's happened before where the government had like given shed loads of money to put in loft in people's insulation in people's lofts. And the beneficiaries of that were builders who essentially became door-to-door salesmen. Like, can I come and put loft in your insulation? It'll cost you anything.
Yeah. There's another issue with that as well, where they actually put a load of people out of business because they were they had to claim the money from the government, but they were so slow in paying back the money to the installers that it put a load of them out of business as well. So it's just like, I don't know, it just said it all about the how seriously take it.
Sorry.
I was wondering if you could answer, like, obviously retrofitting is like the most retrofitting the entire house, and every aspect of it, the most efficient way of achieving standards. But you can say, okay, like, what if you were to first start with this one of the I just wonder, especially when we're talking about renting, if you can answer any solutions. Renters hacks that we can do in a lot more manner than we
yeah, so I think it is difficult, but I think John, I think you worked on quite an interesting piece of work, like the what's it, experimental residential.
I know.
Was that you worked on that? You, or was that just?
No, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which is looking at how to turn non-residential to large kind of shared housing. An element of that was kind of just like very, very low budget. Something that installed in our space. Actually, some like art studio clients. Yeah, I'm a bit. I'm not sure. I can see the value in very consistent. That's where.
Yeah, but I think even doing this project, this hackathon, so it was a really interesting process because I was put in a group with, it was a mix of students and sort of professionals. It was about 5, 6 of us, so about half of them students. But our team in particular had, the other team had a lot of architects and building science professionals in their teams. It was me, it was someone who used to be editor of Fashionable, journalist, and someone who was setting up their own sort of lifestyle brand approach to creating kind of new, sort of more sustainable aspiration around lifestyle, basically. And we were having conversations like this, like why can't, because they was totally sold on retrofit, but they were quite like new to the technicalities of it. They were sort of asking questions like, well, why can't you not just do it yourself? And like, I think through the work that we've done with Polpo, it's kind of, you can do some measures, but it's, I think with retrofit, it's so case specific. And in putting bits of insulation in certain places, you create, you know, you can create damp issues, you can actually create more issues, more health issues, and more issues with the building as a consequence of you trying to sort of improve the thermal performance of the building. So in that instance, it is a bit tricky to do it on the cheap. But maybe there is more work to be done on like how actually do we mobilise and do this stuff ourselves. Like I don't think we should discount that as an approach, but I think it does have to be treated. Yeah, I think it's just really important to sort of like going down that route, sort of really familiarise yourself with what already exists, to then provide some degree of solution, or maybe just experiment and just fuck it up. I don't know.
I came across the website one day, and it was like the how to improve your energy efficiency at home. And it was like you can screw this wind stopping brush to your entrance door. That kind of stuff, like really low tech.
Yeah, things.
And it was like a manual, like what can you do at home? Kind of renters friendly, most stuff. I find this tragic, to be honest.
Yeah.
The Windows situation, I'm just like, I can't get used to it. It's like wind coming into the window that's closed.
Yeah.
In all the apartments I live here.
But it does start with that. I think that is quite a good point. Like it is both quite depressing to think that that's also doing anything, but then also it's like it is a degree of like scaling up. Like, you know, you should make some small decisions, like small actions, and then
it's like, I'm sorry, I keep carrying about my flat, but there are sash windows, right? Like the sliding up and sliding down, and they were like, they were horrible, and like it took us 3 or 4 months for someone from the agency to come over and look at them, and one of the windows was actually cracked, and like, oh, okay, yeah, that doesn't look good. Like I can make it like temporary fix. I'm like, okay. So the guy literally, because there were these sliders, they were like stuck. So there would be like a gap like this big. So they literally screwed in the frame so it doesn't open anymore.
Temporary fix.
Yeah, this is like, I'm saying this for Europeans, just for you to give a perspective.
No, but that's really important. Like, I think it's worth stressing that, like, actually the UK does actually have some of the worst performing buildings in Europe. And I think because of the housing crisis as well, you know, there is a real lack of choice. Like, you can't be like, oh, really, you should probably just move to a nicer, more sustainable house, because you can't. You know, it's yeah, it's a bit tricky.
I was going to ask something about like this is a big thing in Flanders as well, in Belgium. But with us, we have both issues. Like, we have a lot of houses that are not adapted, like have terrible insulation or air tightness, those kind of things. But at the same time, we have massive amounts of housing which is in suburban sprawl, which is just terribly located.
Yeah.
And there we're in a very big predicament where it's, you know, a very significant part of our housing stock is in this suburban sprawl out in terrible locations that, you know, even if you retrofit it to be a lot more sustainable with, you know, energy efficiency and so on, still you're ridiculously inefficient through the provision of electricity, the provision of services, especially as people get older and those kinds of things. So I think it's an interesting discussion as well, where it's at some point not even anymore about how can we fix this house if the house itself is just the issue. The fact that it is in a location where it honestly should not have been at a certain point.
Yeah.
I think that's a very interesting discussion. I was wondering if there's a similar, because we have a spatial planning policy now, where it is governments or like local governments are incentivized to have, I don't know how you call this, first buyer, the right to buy first. I don't know if this exists. Yeah.
Yeah, we've got some very similar.
Yeah, so you have this, a lot of local governments have this right to buy the plot. And then
local governments.
Local governments, yeah, it's all put on the local governments, unfortunately. But they have the right to buy the plot, tear it down, and put a similar plot somewhere else in the city, or like in a village core.
We have a different right to
densified.
buy, which is like government subsidising people on buying their first home. Which is, yeah.
Oh, wow.
But it's a sticking plaster because it doesn't meaningfully address the situation. It actually just sort of cycles money up towards.
I think you were describing a variant of compulsory purchase.
Yeah.
To be able to buy a particular plot of land if it for a particular strategic reason.
Yeah, it's already.
Yeah, I mean, that was something that came up in the project. It's like, right, if we really need to sort of build at this kind of scale, and we really need to sort of, you know, the mechanism doesn't really exist, or like, you can't just compulsory purchase. Well, maybe we should, you know, compulsory purchase like whole swathes of our housing stock. I mean, this is the thing. I think what was interesting is it does bring up. I don't think it necessarily says this is a solution, but it's just a far wider conversation around this. Like, how do you navigate that issue of ownership and transferring of ownership, or negotiating ownership between people, or
What were the steps to realising communal ownership in your block?
So there was a kind of suggestion that they put through the government would instate a kind of legal mechanism where if so many residents vote for their neighbourhood to be retrofitted, then there's a statutory obligation for all of those residents to comply, or they're kind of bought out. So I was suggesting it could be something like 67%. And actually, I think, oh, but look, because I think someone actually suggested, was talking to someone, they were like, oh yeah, we have that here. Yeah, here we go. So I think there's some, don't know how similar it is, but someone said there's like a French or a Dutch model of that. Some shape or form. Whether it relates to retrofit or not, I'm not sure, but I think there are. You know, but I mean, again, it kind of begs questions like, well, you know, we do need to have these like difficult conversations, like, if it's not business as usual, we do need to change, like, you know, yeah, how do we do it?
Thank you so much, James. That's
Inception.